Every day we use something that was created using a forest product. Just think about it. That desk you might be working on, that paper you might still use in your day-to-day life, or that lumber that built your home or apartment. Yet rarely do we think about where those products come from, how they are produced, and perhaps more important, the people who produce them. With 9% of the world's forests and growing demand for forest products, there is a big opportunity for Canada in forestry. As our country moves to meet zero-emission targets by 2050, Canada has the potential to be a bioenergy and biomaterials powerhouse on the world stage. The sector has embraced the emerging clean tech, low-carbon era, using innovation and new technology to create opportunities and jobs for Canadians. And yet, the road ahead is not without its challenges. Welcome to Season 5 of inFocus with David Coletto. I'm David Coletto. On this episode of inFocus, I'm joined by Derek Nighbor, the President and CEO of the Forest Products Association of Canada. Derek and FPAC have been a long-time client, and this week we released some new polling data on what Canadians know and think about forestry in Canada. Derek and I spoke about forestry, the debate about its future, and the challenges facing the industry, all in the context of the climate crisis, global supply chain disruptions, and geopolitical conflict. I hope you find my chat with Derek insightful, and I hope you enjoy it. Well, Derek, great to see you and talk to you. Thanks for joining the podcast. How you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, David.
So, Derek, you're the President, CEO of the Forest Products Association of Canada. It's one of those sectors I've worked in for a number of years, gotten to know a lot about it. But to be honest, as somebody who grew up around Toronto and then spent most of my adult life in Ottawa, I've lived pretty far away from anything that can be described as a forest that's used to harvest lumber or wood. Maybe you could take listeners just through a quick briefing of the industry in Canada, how big it is, how many people work in it, and what's the outlook for your members right now as they sort of try to get through what I imagine is a challenging period of time.
Yeah, I think it's challenging in different ways for a lot of different industries. So maybe starting with our footprint. So you think about the forests across Canada, about a little over half of our forests are unmanaged. So more than half the forests in Canada, there's no, kind of formal harvesting activity happening. On the remaining 49% or so, about half of that is today under some kind of a conservation measure, and I think that speaks to the multiple values management that happens in Canadian forestry. So in the operating area, in terms of workers, we've got about 225,000 direct employees. Our ratio along from direct to indirect is about 3-to-1, so another 600,000 plus indirect jobs. But I think what's interesting in our sector, it's the communities that really rely on us. I think of communities like the Paw, Manitoba, and Atholville, New Brunswick. Really the biggest game in town in terms of jobs. So the rural, northern, remote link is really important. I also, you think about where we operate and where Indigenous peoples live. A significant connection. Indigenous peoples in Canada now directly control 10% of the wood supply. Over 1,400 Indigenous-owned forestry businesses and over 12,000 Indigenous workers in our sector. So a lot of unique factors or attributes of our sector, mainly linked to geography.
So you talk to the CEOs of your member companies regularly. What is, if anything, keeping them up at night right now?
Well, today this has been the CP work stoppage, right? So that resolution is really welcome. So we've have some supply chain issue. I think this is one of the challenges across multiple sectors, is especially the last couple of years. It's been really, really tough with blockades and work action and not able to get rail cars to our mills. So I know Minister Alghabra is working on that, and we're participating in that supply chain discussion in terms of improving, I would say, Canada's reputation, because that's a drain on our reputation. It's a drain on investment and confidence in Canada. a carbon and climate are top of the list. And I think this is the biggest challenge, yet the biggest opportunity for our sector. What you can get from a barrel of oil, you can basically get from a tree. So we're seeing huge opportunity given the carbon storing attributes of wood, but also the displacement opportunities of wood and what would otherwise be wood waste to make things like bioplastics and biofuels. So the green agenda that the current government is on is a real winner for our sector. I think the biggest challenge we have is getting the government to look at our sector in a more integrated, full value chain kind of way versus this series of policy one-offs we seem to find ourselves in.
So let's talk a little bit about sustainability and climate for a minute. I mean, if you go to your website, bold right on the front page, it says, Canadian forestry is sustainable forestry. What does that mean? In terms of how it's done and how we compare to other countries in terms of how we manage forests and harvest.
I think the really big, uniquely Canadian factor here is that we're primarily operating on public land. I chair our global association representing 28 countries around the world. There's no other country at that table that has as much forest activity on government land. So that's really. So the social license test is very high. And I also say that the multiple values and the wishes of local communities is critically important in Canada. And that's why, before one tree is harvested, there's a very rigorous community consultation planning and with over, 94% of the lands that we're operating on being under the purview of provincial governments, governments need to sign off on the plans before a tree is harvested. So I think we've got that unique factor in Canada. The other part is, I think people are always surprised about, is how the planning is done. Depending on the province, the planning cycles are 1 to 200 years out, looking at, previous windstorms and previous fire patterns to try to emulate nature in how we're managing our harvesting. So, and then also that, that commitment to keep forests as forests forever, counter to what we're seeing in some countries in South America and issues around illegal logging in places like Russia that are still a big problem. We have a choice in a global market. Do we want to continue to sell more Canadian wood to the world, or do we want to be importing more products from places like the Amazon? So we've got a really unique Canadian band. We also have a lot of trees. We have like over 9,000 trees per Canadian. So managing those sustainably, respecting biodiversity, I'd say those are really the tenets of sustainable forest management in Canada. But that community link, that community input piece is really critical. And I say to my urban friends, it's not unlike a residential rezoning project, right? You're going to have different people with different ideas on what that should look like. So it's not always consensus. There are some people that might not like how a plan is unfolding, but that community engagement, that multiple values piece is absolutely critical.
This government, the Liberal government, has talked a lot about conservation and wanting to, protect a larger percentage of Canadian land and shoreline and other things. How is that agenda? Does it impact the work you're doing as an association and as an industry in terms of, wanting to see continued growth in the sector, but also having, I assume some hurdles in your ability to sort of achieve that? Like how does that all work in your day-to-day life, I guess?
Yeah, it's complicated, as most things are in our sector, but forestry in Canada is inherently about conservation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you look at the land base that we're operating on today, it's about 25% of our overall forest land base because of unmanaged areas, and then also conservation initiatives that are built into our forest managing plans. There's a hawk's nest there, so we need a buffer zone. There's a water a body there. We need a buffer around that. There's a peatland that's carbon rich. We want to protect that. There's a sensitive species over here. So all of, the biologists and foresters do all of that planning. So, those who want to talk about conservation being a zero-sum game, it's either protected or not. We don't see the world that way. There's a lot of gray in our world, and forestry is about conservation. The issue I'm finding is, especially in Canada, and if you're in the interior British Columbia, or if you're in, northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, you've seen some pretty brutal fires the last number of years, and fires are not only bad in terms of how they impact the safety of communities and families, and insurance costs and all these other financial and human health and human safety related challenges. But fires are also pretty bad for carbon. Like we've got a carbon problem in our forests because of fire, and not managing our forests, and not thinning our forests, and not having boots on the ground is going to make fire worse. And I know Minister Wilkinson, with his New Brunswick ministerial partner, have launched a wildland fire strategy conversation with multiple tables. We think that's really important. But just because you protect it doesn't mean it's going to be immune from the impacts of climate change. I know ECCC, or Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Parks Canada have been doing some work on assessing the carbon stocks in our protected areas. Many of our national and provincial parks are now carbon sources. So protecting it doesn't mean that it's going to be protecting it from fire, for example. So that's the nexus. That's where I think we're encouraging the government. We're not anti-conservationists. I think I want to be very clear about that. But we do need to be clear that protecting it doesn't mean putting a dome over it and it's going to be beautiful and perfect and immune forever. It's going to be subject to pest infestations. It's going to be subject to wind and drought impacts, fires. So getting that balance right, casting a fire lens on our conservation initiatives, I think is going to be really, really important. But it all starts with acknowledging the important conservation that's happening within our managed or our working forests.
Today, we released some new polling data that your team commissioned our company to do. The survey was done earlier this year, and it found that impressions and knowledge about forestry in Canada are improving or increasing. So, for example, positive impressions of the forestry industry increased by 8 points since last year, by 14 percentage points since 2020. So today you've got almost half of Canadians who say they have a positive view of the industry, while only 16% view it negatively. There's still a large, but as we've seen over the last number of years in doing this tracking, large but shrinking number of people who say, I don't know, I don't have an opinion. It's still large, 40%. And I've done work in other sectors. And, as we've talked about a lot, Canadians don't have a real appreciation for forestry. They don't know a lot about it. But generally speaking, those that do have a pretty good view of it. We also seen that more Canadians in the survey that we did say they at least have a limited understanding than they did last year, an 8-point increase, which is real and substantial. And then lastly, when we ask folks to rate how the sector is doing on things like, creating good jobs, managing forests sustainably, being a responsible producer, clear majority say that the sector is doing at least acceptably, but a growing number say it's doing well or good on those measures. Now, this research comes really off of the work that your association's been doing over the last number of years to try to increase, I think, awareness about what the industry is doing, about its real mission to be a net zero sector and contribute, not just be net zero, but actually contribute to reducing emissions. Can you tell us a little bit about that campaign and what instigated it and what you're hoping to ultimately achieve from it?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think it's about simple messages, right? Like we're such a technical, heavy, science-based, operating across a massive amount of land in hundreds and hundreds of communities with so many people working along the chain. It's very confusing business. And I think the most confusing part is the multiple values piece. Mm-hmm. Even when you're managing for species, when our foresters and biologists are developing their plans, you can conceivably have a community that has, moose and caribou. Well, they want different things on the landscape. So how do you plan for that? You use best science, you take local input, and you make a decision. Same thing, with grizzly bears. We've got parts of Alberta where grizzly bears and caribou populations are both struggling, but they both want different things in terms of what that harvest looks like. So I think we get caught up in our industry, and we trip over a lot of that real multiple values conflict that goes on. and we kind of get stuck there. So we've really tried to be more simplistic and straightforward in terms of our language. I think we've also, I've been on the job now a little over 6 years, and I remember when I came in here, I was thinking, my God, we're really good at talking to ourselves, right? Like, why are we not? I'm not. People in the PAW, people in Pembroke, people in Prince George know us. What are we doing to talk to people in Markham? What are we doing to talk to people in Fredericton? Talk to people in outside of Calgary? Those are the communities we need to reach to more. So that's what has been the other focus: getting to more urban, suburban type audiences, getting to more women, to younger people, because these are people who are actually open to understanding the facts and learning more. That 10 or 11% of the people who can't stand us, to be quite honest, I'm not worried about them. If 10% of the people can't stand us, I think we're doing pretty darn good if I stack that up against other issues. And it's not to say we're going to ignore those people, but I encounter, during my job, as my colleagues do here, sitting at tables where there are people who are not interested in any solutions. They're not interested in any balance. They want no forestry, full stop. So those are not the people we need to talk to. We need to engage with those people appropriately, but we need to talk to the people who don't have an opinion. And there are a number of them out there, and they are open to receiving the facts and learning more. The other thing I'd say, it is that rural-urban divide we find ourselves in forestry. And I think, urban audiences now, to the opportunity I'm seeing there is, we're now seeing, we're seeing a renaissance or a new focus on urban forestry. People in London, Ontario are seeing seeing pest outbreaks in their urban forests and in their urban trees. So think about that. That relates back to what's happening in the bigger, more northern forests as well. We need to manage, we need to tend to our trees. The other urban connection, I think, is the building with wood agenda. We're seeing mass timber buildings in places like Vancouver and Toronto and Quebec City. That's, the carbon storing power of those wood buildings, the displacement opportunity in terms of using wood versus other materials that are more fossil fuel intensive. Urbanites are now seeing more of that. So I think simple messaging, I think, talking and trying to reach out to non-traditional audiences, when you're dealing with Toronto Life and Shadow Lane, that's where I'd prefer to be honest, reaching out to those audiences. And then I think also the connection points where people in urban and suburban communities can maybe relate more to things like urban forestry and mass timber buildings.
Maybe a strange question, but when you talk to senior policy leaders and influencers, elected officials at the federal government level, do you get a sense that they're proud of Canada's sort of leadership and role in forestry? Is it something they like want to talk a lot about, or are you pulling teeth sometimes to get them to acknowledge and be advocates for the sector?
Yeah, I think a number of them do, for sure. I think there's something quintessentially Canadian about forestry still. I think, as urbanization increases, as more new Canadians come, that connection becomes less so than, my grandma worked at the mill or my dad worked at the mill kind of thing. But so I still think it's my observation is it's still pretty strong. That said, government has a lot of stuff on the go, especially the last couple of years. It's been crisis after crisis, and it's government in chaos, with a lot of stuff beyond government's control. It can be tough to break through when you have a mainly urban seated government and on issues like ours. And so I think that's been more the challenge. I also think one of the other challenges is, our solutions, especially if we talk about the carbon and climate agenda, our solutions, I'm kind of jealous of my colleagues in steel and cement who can just focus on emissions reductions at their manufacturing facilities and some product innovation, because we've got the land base to worry about. Like we go all the way back, and we not only need to manage the land base for carbon, but we also need to manage it in partnership with Indigenous communities and Indigenous cultural values and rights. We need to manage it for species at risk. We need to manage it for floods. But in the forest, we have a huge, and through fire risk mitigation, a huge opportunity to do more in the carbon space. Then, you move that to the mills and the opportunity to make bioplastics and displace products. I think, we've got this full value chain, massively complex suite of solutions and possibilities. And I just feel that the government just doesn't quite grasp that. And that's one of our bigger challenges. We can go on a clean fuel rig and make that work, and we can go on a wildland fire strategy and make that work. But unlike most sectors, it's all interconnected and interrelated for us, and that's a big challenge in terms of breaking through with government.
I think, when I study public opinion and look at it through the lens of like industry reputation and whether or not people want government to regulate an industry more or support it and sort of advance it, there's a number of key things we look at. One is just how do people feel about it? And as we said earlier, the more or less general consensus of those that have an opinion is most people don't see anything wrong with forestry as it is, and there's a general positive view and it's getting better over time. But when we ask people, do you think Canada is a world leader when it comes to forest, how we manage our forests? Is it about average or is it less than average? Most people say we're about average. And my understanding, based on our conversations and the work that I've done with you, is we are clearly above average when it comes to how we manage our forest. So I think that's despite the positive moves, there's still some work to be done. And I do wonder if it's because, in part, our political leaders aren't out there, reminding Canadians of how we do things. You see it in Alberta, for example, when it comes to oil and gas. Jason Kenney's always out there talking about how much better and more sustainable that industry is relative to others around the world, or ethical in some ways. Mm-hmm. But you don't hear that when it comes to forestry, I think, as often. Do you think that would help in building sort of public support for, seeing government not reduce regulations? I don't think that's what you're looking for, but being more of a partner and an advocate for the industry, not just here at home, but around the world, because it's clear this is still a resource that can create wealth and opportunities for people, as you said, especially in those communities that don't have as much alternatives, right? If a mill closes in some of those towns you mentioned, that town really, takes a real a step back in terms of its progress and its opportunities. So that just seems to me that difference of opinion on where Canada stands is still an opportunity that could be closed with some help.
Yeah, and maybe I'll start at the micro level, at that community level. Not only if your property value drops by 50+%, like you kind of, your marriage is strained. There's stress in your home. You can't pay to send your kids to hockey or dance class. It's there. We talk about equity and affordability, and one of the best ways we can do that is by strengthening our rural economies, and a big part of that is our natural resources sectors. And I we hear the government talk a lot about equity and inclusion and opportunity. And in a community, I grew up in Pembroke, Ontario. I mean, like the natural natural resource sector is critical to that community, and I think that needs to be acknowledged and kept in mind. I'd also say that I think what kind of a Canada do we want? I think I'd rather have wood products coming from Canada than the Amazon or 8 hours outside of Moscow. But this is who we're competing with. We look to Scandinavia a lot in terms of, I think, governments and populations that get it right. There was a report out a few weeks ago. Dr. Werner Kurtz from Natural Resources Canada was one of the authors. It was through the International Boreal Forest Research Alliance, which is all the boreal forest countries, including Russia and Sweden and Finland and the US and Canada. And it pointed out, it was looking at carbon stocks, and it showed that actually the Swedish and Finnish forests that were managed actually more intensively had a better carbon story, plus they were providing wood and bio-based products for their population and actually being pretty self-sufficient. We don't see that as much in Canada and Alaska, because of our current approach to forest management, and that's not only a challenge for economic opportunity and growth, but it's also a challenge on the carbon side. So, that's an important development. And I just met with a delegation of Finnish MPs yesterday Canada here in Ottawa, and it's from left to right on the political spectrum. There's some difference of opinions for sure, but a real understanding that what do we want to build with? We'd rather build with wood. We would rather have less fossil fuel intensive products, and wood waste can help get us there. We can build district heating systems using biomass. So my observation in meeting with the Finnish MPs was just a much more integrated whole value chain, whole of society opportunity, and I feel we're missing that in Canada. And it'll be interesting to see, with the invasion of Ukraine and the instability and just sadness that's bringing, the affordability crisis, looking at the rate of inflation now. Like, we have this resource here at home. What more can we do to develop it while driving and creating a greener economy, and at the same time keeping good family supporting jobs in communities that don't have a lot of other options? So we're pretty, listen, we've got a lot of challenges, but we're pretty excited about the potential. It's our opportunity to push through and get policymakers to be looking at us in a more integrated, kind of full value chain kind of way.
Let's just finish the last few minutes here. This is a podcast, I like to say, intersection of public opinion, politics, and policy. So let's talk a little politics for a minute. I spend a lot of time working with folks like you, Derek, and others in agriculture and natural resource sectors who, I often hear, not necessarily from association heads, but a lot of their members feel this when I present, that this federal government doesn't seem to either understand or, worse, care to understand their sectors very well. And do you think that's true? You mentioned earlier the increased urban nature of this government. If you actually look at sort of the seats that the government has in terms of its caucus, it's become more urban over time, especially in minority government settings. Does that reflect its willingness or just its ability to understand, what folks and businesses in those resource-based communities are going through, or is it just something that's never going to happen because they don't represent those communities?
Yeah, I have hope here. I do think that a big part of the challenge is just how chaotic and how many priorities there are that our MPs and senior public servants have. Like, these are heavy agendas. It's tough to get somebody focused even in a 30-minute meeting, to deeply understand. It's a real challenge. So, I think I'm sure there's some people who don't care about forestry. I'm not, but I do think it's more of a lack of understanding, lack of just bandwidth to try to understand it. But I see opportunity there in terms of connecting, on those more urban links, urban forestry, mass timber building construction. We're seeing a lot of MPs who are really energized about some of these mass timber buildings in their more urban communities. They see that potential, and that's a great connection point for us. The 2015 election, in 2019, we lost a number of Liberal MPs. I think of people like Kim Rudd in Cobourg, who knew us well, Mike Bossio in the Bancroft area, who knew us really well, Bob Nault, who they were all replaced by solid MPs. But on the government caucus side, if you overlay the boreal forest, which is the main operating area of a number of our sector, if you overlay that with the electoral map, there's not a ton of red there. There's a lot of orange, there's some light blue, there's some dark blue, and that is a challenge as well. That said, we've got a number of great champions in caucus on the Liberal side, but not as many as we had in 2015. That's for sure. So that continues to be a challenge as a government is dealing with a very, very heavy agenda. But where we see, there's nothing more frustrating when you're in a leadership role like ours at an association that's really committed to doing the right thing, when you see pretty absolute value alignment of your organization with the current government, because that's what I see in forestry, on equity, diversity, and inclusion, on reconciliation, on economic growth for rural Canada, on a transition to a lower carbon economy. We're there. Listen, our association, I think we were pariahs in the late 90s when we supported the Kyoto Protocol. I don't know of any other industry group in Ottawa that was on board with Kyoto, but we were. So we haven't come to this Green Party late. But what I just wish more decision makers saw the full value chain opportunity versus coming to us on this one species at risk matter or on this one clean fuel reg matter. That's our biggest priority in the weeks and months ahead, to get government to adopt more of a sectoral action plan approach to green growth. Because forestry, we have the tools. We just need the policy levers to enable us to achieve the possible.
I mean, when I think of some of the liabilities, again, purely political for the Liberals in particular, it's this idea that they have, they don't care, or they don't want to care about sort of some folks who live in other parts of the country, and that polarization we're seeing, I think, reflected partly by the occupation in Ottawa and the protests and the truckers, that's sort of the most aggressive and intense version of it. But there is this sense that I don't know is necessarily true, but it's the perception, and in my world, perception's all that matters, that the government kind of is condescending or looks down at folks who work in certain sectors. And it seems to me that if they're looking at a longer term strategy politically, that in order to get back to a majority, you do have to overlay some of those communities you described with red again. That forestry kind of is a no-brainer as a sector. You could go out there and say, look, we care about innovation and super clusters and sort of the knowledge economy, but we also care about making sure that Canada is a leader in some of these other sectors, and forestry is a perfect example. Like, it just seems to me, as you said, that the value alignment is so strong that if they wanted to kind of pivot away from that perception, they could do so fairly easily by being a partner and an advocate.
Yeah, I think it's very easy, and I view our organization as being a tremendous bridge between this federal government and rural and northern Canada. Because of that value alignment on desired policy outcomes, we're very much aligned. But the path to get there has been excruciating. Like we are facing like consultations to death here. I think we fed into 11 or 12 consultations between late November and mid January. Like I want our team to have a couple of days off at Christmas, for God's sake. Like it was, and I'm not convinced anybody reads them. Like this is what drives me crazy. It's all these one-offs, and I get it's tough. Listen, and in our industry, it's even tougher because we're on provincial crown land primarily. So we've got all the beauty of federalism to deal with in terms of provincial responsibility. But no, that's our ask. I think we can be a real bridge. And I grew up in Pembroke. Like I've stayed pretty close to the ground. Despite how privileged I recognize I am in this role and to have what I have. But I'm up my mom and dad's every few weeks, and my mom and dad are on oil because natural gas does not go to RR7 Pembroke. My mom and dad, I've been very progressive parents in supporting their gay son and are really involved in their community and are really good people. But their bills, life is getting more expensive for them. And I do think what we saw in the convoy here, and this is Derek as an individual speaking versus my organization, but like we saw, I live just a few kilometers from the core, so this was awful. I hated every minute of this, and there was some really dark sides to that, which I think is very unsettling to anybody who lived here. But I know some people who came here on the weekends, and they're not bad people, right? But they're people who are feeling more insecure. They're feeling they don't have a voice. And I hope we listen to that in some way that does not advantage or pay more attention than needed to the hateful elements that were present. But there is an element of insecurity, and we're seeing that in rural Canada. And I think when people become a bit more insecure or more concerned about their economic prospects, their ability to provide for their families, they can do things that maybe are a little bit out of character or seem kind of nasty. And anyway, it's I share that because of where I've come from and a community that I stay close to, and I'm worried about the affordability piece. I'm really worried about what this means for families. I know I'm going to be fine. But this is about those families that don't have the privilege that I have, or don't have, I think in terms of public policy development, we need to be more mindful of that. I also think the words we use matter. Who knows what net zero is? My mom and dad don't know what net zero is. So how do we move that well-intended, I believe, position of trying to do the right thing, but do more talking with people than talking at them. And I think, as I said, I think forestry can be a tremendous bridge. We've got a lot to offer. We can drive economic and low carbon / green opportunity concurrently, and we can do that at the same time as advancing reconciliation with Indigenous people. So, we stand, we're ready to help, and we're ready to do more. But I think the big ask we have, of course, is just a more clear, and I don't want to say strategy, because when I hear strategy, I want to go hide under the desk, right? But we need an action plan that's more comprehensive, that's going to lift our sector and its people.
Well, my hope is, and I think not all political actors in Ottawa, I think, are feeling this way, but I think by us watching what's going on in Ukraine and what's gone on in the United States, that we do feel that, we are increasingly divided as a country. We had some survey research we did a few weeks ago that showed, most Canadians are feeling we are more divided. Maybe the news, this week of the NDP Liberal kind of agreement to bring some stability to government I'm not wishful to believe politics will always extrude itself from public policy making, but maybe that stability will give us a chance to kind of focus on some of those bigger pictures now that the threat of an election every few months is off the table. But anyways, really, really fascinating conversation, Derek. And I think, beyond those interested in forestry or natural resources or all the things that your members are doing, there's a lesson in this conversation about our politics and how, as a country, we bridge the divide between an increasing urban country, but one that has this massive landmass with lots of resources that people around the world are going to want. And as it feels like our world gets smaller, but also, walls are being put up, our ability to kind of sell what we have as being, more sustainable and better is only going to find, I think, more and more interest in some parts of the world. So yeah, it's been always great working with you, and I look forward to working with you again. And thanks so much for joining the podcast today.
Yeah, listen, thanks so much for having me.